fact that the Kremlin has stepped up the attempt to break Ukraine on the energy infrastructure this winter is this may be the last winter where they have the chance to do it. Once you get into spring, things warm up, they've got to go back to the front lines where they're making very, very limited progress. I mean, extremely limited progress. And it's like, what are you going to do? You're at 19.5% of Ukrainian territory that you're taking. You're going to try to get up to 20, and is that going to be your win? Are you going to stop then? Are you going to try to get 21%? Or alternatively, can we get the Americans to give us Donetsk, right? So this is the critical point. I think there have been many critical points in this Russian full-scale invasion as we near the 4-year anniversary, but I think we're getting into a critical point over the next few months. I'm not sure the Russians can sustain this invasion once we get into the autumn. I just don't. I can't say they won't be able to, but I'm not sure they can sustain it, let's say 6 to 9 months from now.
Joining us today is Scott Lucas, Professor of International Politics at the University College Dublin's Clinton Institute. Welcome to our program, Professor Lucas.
Daniel, thank you so much for having me here.
US President Donald Trump has asked Russian dictator Vladimir Putin to halt strikes on Ukrainian energy infrastructure for a week. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy said today that Russian forces are avoiding missile and drone strikes on Ukrainian energy, instead concentrating their attacks on Ukrainian logistics. Why did Vladimir Putin agree to halt strikes on Ukrainian energy for a week, and what are the main reasons behind this temporary pause in strikes?
Daniel, that may be the easiest question you asked me during this interview, because the reason why the Kremlin halted the attacks on energy infrastructure since Friday is because they did not want to give Trump an excuse to get upset that they were undermining this process where Trump thinks, oh, I'm going to get the Nobel Peace Prize out of it. Ukraine and the United States had actually asked Russia to halt the strikes going back to February 22nd, which was about a week and a half ago. We got up to last Friday, the 29th, and Ukraine said, okay, we're halting our strikes. We're halting the strikes on Russia, indeed, for a week. But the Kremlin wasn't committing to anything. And then finally it said, okay, we'll halt the strikes until Sunday. And they had to do that because the key event over the weekend that I think almost no one noticed, certainly not in the Western European press and not in the American press, is that the Kremlin sent Kirill Dmitriev, who is Vladimir Putin's top financial advisor, but more importantly, he's the Kremlin's person that works with, arguably tries to manipulate the Trump envoys, real estate developer Steve Witkoff and Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner. They sent him to Florida on Saturday to meet with Witkoff and Kushner and with the U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. Because remember that the talks were supposed to take place in Abu Dhabi on Sunday. That's when the second round of talks were supposed to take. And then the Russians pulled back and they wouldn't send anybody. In fact, the Americans pulled back before that, to be precise, that the Trump administration said Witkoff and Kushner would not be going to Abu Dhabi. Instead, Witkoff and Kushner are talking with Kirill Dmitriev, the same person that they talked to in late October when they issued this 28-point ultimatum to Ukraine to give up territory and to have no effective security guarantees, and to make sure that money from Ukrainian recovery actually went to the United States, profits effectively. So what is Dmitriev talking to Witkoff and Kushner and the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent about? What are the issues that they're talking about here? Now, that's a question we can pick up in just a minute, but it would have looked really bad if Russia had continued to attack energy infrastructure while they're sending Kirill Dmitriev across the United States. But as you also noted, it was a pretty low-cost concession for the Russians to make, because even though they're trying to break Ukraine with the attacks on energy infrastructure, they could just shift their attacks at least for 48, 72 hours onto other areas that they want to break which in this case was the logistics, especially the railway infrastructure. And as as people in Ukraine know, that some very horrible incidents with mass killings in or near railways, which have taken place in recent days, including the train carriage that got hit in Kharkiv. And again, I'll emphasize, because even if they supposedly halted attacks on energy infrastructure, the Russians murdered at least 12 miners yesterday and injured around about 15 others in south central Ukraine when they hit a bus near the mines that they were trying to attack. So yeah, it was a fairly low-cost state, quote concession, if you want to call it a concession for Russia to make, because they're trying to get the diplomatic advantage back in the talks by manipulating the Americans and by forcing Ukraine to give up territory.
Let's cover also this, we just discussed this so-called energy ceasefire. Could this pose in strikes on Ukraine mean any kind of possibility of diplomatic opening? Because Financial Times reported that this would be a test for Putin's willingness to settle the war, and The Economist reported that this could be a sign of hope, or a positive hope for a lasting peace in Ukraine or full energy ceasefire.
Diplomatic opening for what? I mean, that's the question here, because what we know is that before the ceasefire over the weekend, indeed, going back after the first round of the talks in Abu Dhabi a few weeks ago, that the Trump camp, probably Witkoff and Kushner, are telling Ukraine, you give up the rest of the Donetsk region, the strategic area in the east of your country, you give that up. You let the Russians have it, or at least fully withdraw your troops from that area, and then you'll get security guarantees from the U.S. Well, that's not negotiation as such. That's just reframing the ultimatum to Ukraine, which says, oh, you want security, at least on paper, from us, from the U.S., as well as from Europe. Then you give up Donetsk. You give up those fortified areas that Russia have been trying for years to take, and that they still cannot take. You just hand that to the Russians. So no, with respect to the media reporting this, too often they get drawn into the idea of that these are negotiations where a deal might or might not be imminent, and they forget the fundamental here. The Kremlin has said clearly, we will not accept anything less than getting all of the Donetsk region, and we will not accept security guarantees that include, for example, European forces inside Ukraine. We will not accept these. And there's no sign that the Russians are going to compromise on this. Instead, what the Kremlin are trying to do is to use the Americans to force Ukraine into surrender on these key points. And we need to make that clear. That's what this is.
Let's cover also another round of negotiations this week in Abu Dhabi. US, Ukraine and Russia will conduct another trilateral talks. Also, according to Axios, Trump's special envoy Steve Witko will participate in these negotiations. What are your expectations and your take on the upcoming round? Does it still make any kind of sense to participate in these meetings? Endless diplomacy without clear results?
Well, I mean, the Ukraine president, Volodymyr Zelensky, has made it quite clear that you participate in this, that you try to get the talks because you want any possibility, even if it is a slim possibility, to end the Russian invasion. But also you participate in these talks because you hope that if the Kremlin, as I expect, does not negotiate, does not try to reach a meaningful settlement, then you get the political, the economic high ground, even the military high ground, with not only Europe, but with the Americans, which says, look, the Kremlin is not going to accept a deal which is satisfactory, at least in terms of ending the invasion. They just want a capitulation from us. So you need to back us. You need to back our defense against Russia. And by that, it means you need to back our air defenses, you need to provide other support for us on the front lines in the battlefield, and you need to support our operations inside Russia, hitting the Russian oil refineries, hitting the Russian railways, et cetera. And you need to tighten sanctions, right? So you go through the talks to either get the Russians, and it's a remote chance to agree to ceasefire, or you set up the conditions where you get lasting assurance of U.S. and European support. But that's not what the Russians are doing, and again, the talks were supposed to be on Sunday. So why did the Americans pull out of the talks before then? Well, I suspect it has a lot to do with Kirill Dmitriev going over to Florida. That the Russians said to the Americans, we want to talk to you before the second round of talks. The Americans said, okay, we're not going to send Witkoff and Kushner on Sunday. Kirill Dmitriev shows up on Saturday, and now the talks can go ahead on Monday. But I'll come back to what you and I, along with Sophia, our colleague, have discussed in recent weeks. At those Abu Dhabi discussions are the starting point for the discussions, the Ukraine-Europe proposals since late October, which include a ceasefire on the current front lines, a demilitarized free economic zone in Donetsk, but not one that's Russian occupied, security guarantees for Ukraine, including with European and U.S. participation, a meaningful Ukraine recovery fund, and Ukrainian control of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Is that the starting point for the talks? Or are you going back to the ultimatum that the Russians crafted with Witkoff and Kushner last October, which start with Russia trying to take all of Donetsk, weakening the security guarantees for Ukraine, and putting a priority on U.S.-Russian joint economic projects over Ukrainian recovery? Which of these two documents, proposals, are going to be the basis for the talks?
Let's also cover recent reporting by Bloomberg and the New York Times about new Russian economic problems. Russian oil prices have fallen to their lowest levels, and Russian economy minister said this month that the average price of Russian oil was $39 per barrel in December, down from more than $57 per barrel in August last year. What is your assessment of this reporting and new data provided by Bloomberg?
Well, I think the latest data on Russian oil prices shows that the Russians have got a serious issue with revenues, which we have known have been building for months. And the catalyst for this was the tightening. Despite Trump and some in his camp, like Witkoff and Kushner, working with the Kremlin, that there were others in the administration that had gotten these sanctions, these tough sanctions on Russia's oil companies and on Russia's customers. So Russia, in order to sell oil, including to some of these large customers, like the Chinese, like the Indians, like the Turks, they have to consider giving bigger discounts on oil. I'm trying to remember the level, the oil price level in the Russian government budget. I think it's $59 per barrel, but I would have to double check. But let's say it's in the 50s, and if you're only getting less than $40 per barrel, you've got a serious problem in terms of funding your government budget. Now, when you can't fund your government budget, you have to make cuts or raise taxes. Now, the Russians raising taxes on a population already being told to sacrifice for the war, the invasion, well, that's kind of tough. Well, okay, are you going to cut your military spending? No, you're not. You're not going to cut military spending because you're pursuing an invasion. So what? You have to cut social services. You have to cut those areas that help Russians in terms of their day-to-day lives. And on top of that, you have got pressure on the Russian economy, inflationary pressure, where prices continue to go up. And indeed, in Meduza, the independent Russian outlet today, there's a very good report in the sense of interviewing people inside Russia about their daily experiences. When they're trying to buy basics, and the cost of basics is going up, so they can't buy the type of food that they have bought in recent months, recent years. They can't necessarily have, quote, luxuries beyond trying to cover the basics. They have issues with their energy costs, for example, that take place. Well, how much longer will Russians accept that as the price for the invasion of Ukraine? And that's the open question that we discuss every week, and that we will probably be discussing every week well into 2026. I don't think we're at a tipping point yet where certainly not that the Russian economy is going to collapse. I don't think it's at the point where you have a widespread Russian uprising against the invasion as such. But I think it's something that the Kremlin knows. I think the fact that the Kremlin has stepped up the attempt to break Ukraine on the energy infrastructure this winter is this may be the last winter where they have the chance to do it. Once you get into spring, things warm up, they've got to go back to the front lines where they're making very, very limited progress. I mean, extremely limited progress. And it's like, what are you going to do? You're at 19.5% of Ukrainian territory that you're taking. You're going to try to get up to 20, and is that going to be your win? Are you going to stop then? Are you going to try to get 21%? Or alternatively, can we get the Americans to give us Donetsk, right? So this is the critical point. I think there have been many critical points in this Russian full-scale invasion as we near the 4-year anniversary, but I think we're getting into a critical point over the next few months. I'm not sure the Russians can sustain this invasion once we get into the autumn. I just don't. I can't say they won't be able to, but I'm not sure they can sustain it, let's say 6 to 9 months from now.
According to Bloomberg, quote, President Vladimir Putin faces a narrowing window to reach a peace deal in Ukraine as Russia has these problems with budget. And also Bloomberg points out that US political calendar may become a factor for the Kremlin as President Trump focuses on November's midterm election, with some analysts saying that Trump is offering to end the war are the best on the table for Putin right now to make this deal, to reach the deal before this midterm elections. What is your take on that?
Well, I mean, certainly if it's the case that Witkoff and Kushner go back to like telling Ukraine, give up the Donbass or you don't get security guarantees, yeah, I think that's the Russian win. I think that's, Putin would have liked to have taken all of Ukraine. He would have liked to have put a puppet government in Kyiv. We all know that, right? That's the narrative out there. But since certainly since the Ukraine counteroffensive in September 2022, when Russia lost part of the south and part of the northeast, after having lost the north, having to withdraw from there in spring 22, yeah, I think this was always, the Russian lineup. Could they take the rest of the Donbass? And could they keep Ukraine neutral and weak? That's the target. And they'll get close to it. They'll get close to it if they can flip Witkoff and Kushner and force Ukraine to capitulate. Here's the problem. Ukraine's not going to capitulate. Zelensky's not going to agree. The Zelensky government's not going to agree to give up Donbass. It's just not going to happen. The Zelensky government's not going to agree to keep itself neutral with no hope of security guarantees. And they're not going to agree to that because you know that, your viewers know that better than anything else. You've gone through the experience of the Russians undermining the Budapest Memorandum from the 1990s. You've gone through the experience of the Russians trying to undercut the Minsk process after seizing your territory in 2014. So the Zelensky government's not going to give up Donetsk in response for verbal promises from the Americans or a piece of paper that says, we'll help your security. So that then brings us back to, all right, when Ukraine doesn't agree to this, what do the Trump folks do? Do they completely cut off intelligence sharing? Do they completely cut off all assistance to Ukraine? Do they just simply walk away? And then what do the Europeans do? Can the Europeans fill the gap? And I would say, what I'm interested in is there's going to be an interesting conjunction, and that is that you get the talks in Abu Dhabi that are coming, but then, and I think you're going to be attending this, Daniel, you get the Munich Security Conference, which takes place in a couple of weeks, where you're going to get all the high-level American politicians, the American military figures are going to be there. You're going to get the Europeans are going to be there. You're going to get folks from other countries that are going to be there. And you got to be watching those signals coming out of Munich. A year ago, just a quick reminder, it was at Munich a year ago that J.D. Vance told Europeans and told Ukraine, effectively, you're on your own, folks. We're out of here. Now, people push back against that. Do we get a figure like a J.D. Vance coming back to Munich and saying, again, you're on your own? And if so, how do Europe and Ukraine respond? The Kremlin's best play here is not to win this on the battlefield. The Kremlin's best play here, and I think it's been their best play for a year, is that they break the Trump administration. And what I mean by break is that they finally get Trump, Witkoff, and Kushner and J.D. Vance triumph over others in the administration who still believe in Ukraine security, who still believe in European security.
Do you feel that capturing or acquiring Donetsk region is a real end game for Russia? Like the most important objective, and they, for example, get Donetsk region and war is over without any kind of new attacks, new invasion. Is this a real end game for Vladimir Putin?
I think it's a landing point for the Kremlin if they also water down the security guarantees where they're almost meaningless for Ukraine. And I'll come back to the fundamental, come back to what you know in Ukraine, but Alexander Stubb, the Finnish president, told Donald Trump last August when the European leaders met him in the White House and pushed back on the Alaska summit between Putin and Trump. Here's Trump and people like Witkoff who are like, why can't you give up the Donetsk region? Why can't you just give it up? There's Russian speakers there. And Stubb told Trump, he said, look, that is the strategic fortified area that Ukraine controls. That's the key positions. If you give those up and the Russians occupy them, you've opened up the highway to Kyiv. They can make that move back to Kyiv that they tried in 2022. And if not Trump, at least Trump's advisors bought that. And that's why you saw through September and up until late October, you saw the pendulum swing against the Russians, where there was the move for the U.S. to move towards sanctions on the Russians and to discuss security guarantees with Ukraine and Europe. So yes, I think that this is where the Kremlin could land because, and everybody in Europe knows this, even if you have a quote settlement where the current invasion has stopped, the Russians can launch a new one. They can launch a new invasion from all of Donetsk and make the move across northern Ukraine. And who's going to stop them? Who's going to stop them if the security guarantees have been weakened and if they hold the key positions as the launch point? So I think that is the Russian play from what I'm looking at. They know they'll talk about forcing the Zelensky government out, but they know they can't force the Zelensky government out. But again, Daniel, think this through. If the Zelensky government ever gave her up the Donetsk region, Zelensky's going to be gone as president. Who's going to be his replacement? Is it going to be someone that takes a very firm stand against the Russians? Or is it going to be someone who effectively is going to be the head of a weakened government that can no longer make the stance against Moscow? So there will be political repercussions that the Kremlin will try to exploit if they get all of Donetsk.
We also would like to focus on this economic cooperation efforts meeting between Kirill Dmitriev and U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. What is your take on this, another track of diplomacy, another process?
We need to watch Scott Bessent, now the Treasury Secretary, because the wider story here is, and I've told it before, but I'll repeat it, when the Kremlin looked around the Trump administration at the start of last year, they said, who do we want to work with, right? And they identified Witkoff. They identified Kushner. And that's why they pushed aside or said, look, we won't deal with Keith Kellogg, who was supposed to be the envoy to Ukraine and Russia. They knew they wanted to go to Witkoff. They wanted to go eventually to Kushner because they knew that they could play up to Witkoff's personality, because you don't believe almost anything they say. But they would play up to the idea of, you're a deal maker. You're a deal maker, Steve. You're a real estate expert. We're going to make great economic deals with you. When we finally end this invasion, there's going to be U.S.-Russian deals and everybody's going to profit from it. So we know they've run that line since last spring with Witkoff. We know that's the line they put with him because remember, he was in St. Petersburg first. Kirill Dmitriev showed him on St. Petersburg. Then he goes into Moscow and Dmitriev showed him all here, look, Here's all these areas of Russia that will be part of our great economic engine that can work with you. Well, here we are in February of 2026. And Witkoff and Kushner are again meeting Dmitriev, but now Bezant's talking to him. Now, as far as I know, Bezant hasn't really been involved in meetings with Dmitriev until now. And I've always looked at Bezant as someone who kept his distance from the Witkoff-Kushner faction over the economic terms of trying to end the Russian invasion. But now Bezant's there. What are Dmitriev and Bezant discussing? Are they discussing Ukrainian recovery? I doubt it. Are they discussing the demilitarized free economic zone in Donetsk? Kind of doubt that, because the Russians don't want to make it a demilitarized free economic zone. You got to think that Dmitriev is talking to Bezant about economic relations after the invasion. And that's going to include a couple of things. It's going to include lifting of sanctions, because Moscow is going to say, we've got these great projects, but you've got sanctions on us. How can we have great projects when our businesses are so limited? It's going to involve reaching out to areas and talking about things like rare earth minerals. And it's like, these rare earth minerals, not just in Russia, but, they're in the areas of Ukraine that we control. What about some projects there? It's going to be talking about other energy projects, other manufacturing projects. That's probably what they talked about. Now, does Bezant buy that? Does Bezant buy that line? Because I've used this term with you very much on this split administration, that I've always counted on people who are not the Witkoffs, not the Kushners, not the Vances, who know the economic and political realities of what happens if you cozy up to Moscow. Does Bezant know those realities of what happens? Or has he been turned to think there's this great U.S.-Russian economic future and the rest of the world can be damned, including Ukraine?
Let's also cover another interesting topic today, probably most popular among Western media, the release of another Epstein files. And I would like firstly to cover the general news, general information. There are lots of such files, lots of media stories analyzing lots of topics and lots of angles of the story. What is your assessment of this most new release of Epstein files, and what do we know from this right now?
I'll go to the big story beyond all those individual ones that are flying about, and that is 2.7 million pages were suddenly dumped on a Friday afternoon, Friday evening, when journalists thought they were going to go home and relax for the weekend. So all of a sudden they're dumped, and now it's like, okay, we're going to try to go through all these files. That's going to occupy them, while the big story is, what about the more than 3 million pages that were not released? Because the Justice Department, which is led by Donald Trump's assistants, it's led by the Attorney General Pam Bondi, who has helped Trump for years, from the time when she was a state official in Florida. It is led by the Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche, who is Trump's personal lawyer before taking that position. They gave the excuse over the weekend that those files could not be released because maybe they had material in them that could have been used for criminal investigations, that could have security implications, that could raise questions of security for victims and witnesses. That's their excuse. But Todd Blanche, who was the spokesperson for the Trump people all weekend, he went further and said, there's nothing here that links Donald Trump to the criminal activities of Jeffrey Epstein. Indeed, there's nothing here that links anybody to the criminal activities of Jeffrey Epstein, at least to the point where they will be prosecuted. So everybody can go home now. Although this was the biggest release of the Epstein files, after the Trump administration has held out for a year against releasing them, it was also the biggest stonewall, the biggest attempt to hold back the full extent of the files. I don't know whether or not it will succeed, because what I can tell you here is that it is striking that just as the first release of the photographs last December, the very limited release of Epstein material, the White House pointed the media to anyone but Donald Trump. Here's Bill Clinton. Oh, here's Michael Jackson. Oh, here is Bill Clinton again. Oh, here's Bill Gates. Here's Richard Branson. Here's Bill Clinton and Michael Jackson. They were trying to make the story about anybody except Donald Trump. What we've had over the weekend here is that, with the exception of one document, a list of tips that was given, that the FBI compiled in August 2025, tips that included allegations against Trump. With the exception of that document, the headlines have been about everybody else. Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, the former Prince Andrew, the former UK ambassador to the United States, Peter Mandelson, Elon Musk, the Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, Donald Trump's former chief strategist, Steve Bannon. Let's talk about this, but not Trump. Let's not talk about Trump. The lawyers for the victims said soon after the documents were released on Friday, this is not accountability. This is not transparency. We do not see a lot of the documents that should have been released. We do not see what are called the 302. The FBI's 302 files are when they carry out an investigation, a field investigation. It includes interviews with witnesses, interviews with the victims themselves. And the victims' lawyers said, no, we don't see those. We have not seen the full text of indictments, including the indictment against Jeffrey Epstein in 2007 that led up to his first conviction in Florida. We have not seen the 85-page document about the reasons for that indictment. We have not seen the documents about Epstein's potential co-conspirators. And we know there were more than 10 people who were being considered for prosecution as co-conspirators of Epstein. We haven't seen those documents that have taken place. We have not seen the documents around that list of tips that the FBI compiled, which are horrible, horrible allegations, including against Donald Trump, constituting sexual abuse and even rape. We haven't seen the documents of how the FBI investigated these, what they found out, what they eventually established or did not establish. So when Todd Blanche, Donald Trump's personal lawyer, who became the Deputy Attorney General, said over the weekend, that's it. No one's going to be prosecuted. He was effectively responding to the victims. You don't get transparency. You don't get accountability. Now, what we wait to see now is whether Congress, members of Congress who passed the bill in November that said the Trump administration must fully release the Epstein files, or they must provide evidence as to why certain files have been withheld. We wait to see whether they will be given access to the more than 3 million pages that have not been released. If the Trump people refuse to give them access, will Congress say you have not complied with what we called for? And will they take action against the Trump administration, which is not just political action, it could be legal action, which is contempt of Congress? That's where we are in the big picture, beyond the headlines about specific individuals. And again, that big picture still is, we do not know if the victims of Jeffrey Epstein and these other powerful men, who may or may not have included Donald Trump, will get the justice that they finally deserve after more than 30 years.
Let's also cover another interesting angle of this story, is a possible role of Russian dictator Vladimir Putin and information about Putin in these Epstein files. There have been lots of discussions and some conspiratorial theories about this, about possibility of Jeffrey Epstein being KGB operative, linked to KGB, creating this honey traps for politicians to try to reveal some interesting information on them, to blackmail them with these photos, videos. What is your personal view on possibility of Jeffrey Epstein being KGB operative, working, cooperating with KGB, and the role and Vladimir Putin in these files? What does this mean?
I think we have to be very careful as analysts here. I think it's easy to try to reach for this and say, oh, here's a conspiracy theory that might have substance here. And you go back to what we know. We know that some of the women and girls possibly, that Jeffrey Epstein abused and that other men abused when Jeffrey Epstein got these women, possibly girls, were Russian. We know that from the files that have come out. We know that Ghislaine Maxwell, in one email, tells then Prince Andrew, when Andrew says, "Oh, I have to spend time with my ex-wife and the kids. I can't come to Epstein Island," and Ghislaine Maxwell, Jeffrey Epstein's assistant, says, "Oh, okay, that's a pity." Redacted, an individual whose name has been withheld, and these 5 Russian women, we'll just have to have fun ourselves. So we know this. We don't know the specifics in terms of how Epstein, how these women wind up on Epstein's Island. We don't know the finances in terms of the money that changed hands. We don't know if political deals were made to get these women across. We simply don't know. Now, certainly we could construct scenarios where in exchange for getting these women, Jeffrey Epstein offered favors to Russian officials. Can construct that. But until we have the evidence to put that out there, now I'm not going to go there. And I'm just saying, with respect to the reason why I won't go there, as much as we might want to reach for something because we know how horrible, even evil Vladimir Putin is, we know how much he's done in terms of destroying people's lives, including the lives in Ukraine, and we know how horrible and evil Jeffrey Epstein is and how much he's done to destroy lives. Rather than connecting those individuals, you just go back to, let's just bring out the information that is there about the victims. Let's bring it out there so that they get clarity, they get transparency, they get accountability, and then let the chips fall where they may. If we happen to have further information regarding Epstein's connections with anyone in the Kremlin or in Russia itself.
Thank you, Professor Lucas, for your time and another in-depth analysis, and glory to Ukraine.
Glory to the heroes. Thank you so much, Daniel.